This is the one and only elite recipe source with yet another top tier video recipe. This one's going to be for homemade Goetta that is going to be at least as flavorful and as flippable as anything you can get in a store. That's homemade Goetta in cast iron there. It can be done. Now, I don't normally cook Goetta in cast iron. Of course, the best way to do it is in a good nonstick pan, but I did some in the cast iron to show y'all that if your Goetta has enough structure to it, you can flip it a few times without having it break up or stick to the pan. And I like to be able to flip my Goetta patties a few times as I'm cooking them. That way I can keep checking each side to get it done exactly the way I want it. If your Goetta is too loose, then you're more likely to either break up the patty in the pan when you flip it or when you try to flip it, or you're going to be afraid to flip it too early and you'll end up browning one side too much or even blackening it. So the more structure to your Goetta, the more control you have when you finish it in the pan. I'm going to show you here how to make Goetta from scratch at home that's pretty close to the structure and the flavor of the name brand good stuff. And of course, I'm talking about Glier's. That one is the reference that I'm using. This recipe is somewhat based off the Glier's ingredient list, and that's why I'm including the pork skins here. It's the pork skins that help the finished product hold together better, so it's less likely to break up in the pan when you flip it. Now, unfortunately, in the United States, it can be a little difficult to find pork skins or pork that contains skin in the grocery stores. So if you can't find pork skins, you can substitute gelatin, and I would go about a half teaspoon per pound of meat with that. And I have used the powdered gelatin in place of the pork skins, and it still works out in the end. Now, with the ground meat, the beef is optional. I've gone all ground pork before, and I've substituted ground venison for the ground beef before, and it turned out pretty much the same. What is not optional, of course, is the pork. You got to have a lot of pork fat in there. So I've got the ratio here of about 2 parts regular ground pork to a half part of other ground animal products. And you see I've got 1/4 pound offal or however you pronounce it. That stuff, the organ meat, that is not optional if you're trying to make a Goetta that tastes anything like Glier's. The organ meat, it's kind of like its own seasoning. The Glier's ingredient list has pork hearts on there listed, and so I'll always put some kind of heart in there, whether it's pork heart, beef heart, deer heart, whatever I can get my hands on or whatever I have in my freezer. In addition to the heart, I'll also put a little liver or some other kind of organ meat in there, especially if it's around deer season and I've got that kind of stuff on hand. Here, I've got some deer heart, some deer liver, and lungs. Now, my Goetta will sometimes have a little more of an organ meat flavor than the Glier's does. Some may like that, some not. I like it. It's up to you. But if you're going to try to copy anything like the Glier's flavor, you will need to have some organ meat in there, some heart at a minimum. Here's a shot of just the pork. The rest of the pork I used in this particular batch, a combination of pork belly and pork shoulder. I had to go to a Mexican grocery store to find pork skin, which was attached to the belly. So I separated the skin from the belly and cut the belly meat into smaller pieces for grinding. Obviously, I'm scaling up the recipe I gave. I do about 10 pounds at a time when I make Goetta. Now, for the procedure I'm about to show and about to talk about, I do want to first apologize for not having the full video of the full procedure. I only make a batch of Goetta like once or twice a year. I'll take this recipe and, like I said, scale it up to 10 pounds or so. I'll make a bunch of Goetta, freeze it into about 1 pound portions. Then I'll thaw 1 portion at a time and cut them up into patties and cook the patties for breakfast. So what you're seeing here are some still photos of a previous Goetta making session from about a year or so ago. Now, for this batch, again, I used a mix of pork belly and pork shoulder, as well as a good deal of organ meat. With the pork skin, I cut up and simmered the pork skins in water until they were soft. I strained out the cooked and steamed pork skins, making sure to reserve that water, that cooking liquid, and use it as the liquid in the general recipe. Now, that was the only way to get these pork skins to go through my KitchenAid stand mixer attachment grinder. Trying to grind the raw pig skin with the equipment I had just wasn't going to happen. So the only way was to cook them down first. So I also simmered the organ meat a little before grinding that, and of course I reserved that cooking liquid as well. And I ended up with, at this point, ground raw pork, belly and shoulder, and ground skin and organ meat that was already cooked, as well as the cooking liquid that the skin and organ meat had simmered in. So back to the recipe's proportions, and again, of course, I scale this up a bunch, but I figured 2 pounds of ground pork is a good place to start if you're trying this recipe for the first time. Now, the meat we've got ground and ready to go, and the second ingredient, the liquid, that's going to be the reserved cooking liquid from when you cook the skin and the organ meat, up to the amount of 8 cups per 2.5 pounds of meat. And that ratio is going to be more important toward the end of cooking when we add in the steel cutouts, but that doesn't come until later. If you don't at this point have a quantity of cooking liquid that is quite up to 8 cups per 2.5 pounds of ground meat, then just add water, or better yet, beef or chicken stock to get to that ratio. And so all the liquid and all the meat goes into one pot, and you stir it up. This is the point where you add a couple of bay leaves and start adding salt and pepper to taste. Now, on my recipe, I've got white pepper ahead of black pepper here. This recipe is one where the white pepper is really one of the big stars of the show. You want to use more white pepper than black pepper. I really think the white pepper goes really well with the organ meat, which is also a big part of the flavor here. Also note, I've got MSG, monosodium glutamate. It's on the Glier's ingredient list, so it's here in my recipe because I'm using Glier's as my reference. Also, there's the onion. What I'll do is put my onion through the grinder. If you don't have a grinder, just fine dice or grate your onion. With the organ meat and skins, you can use a food processor, and for the ground pork, you can of course use the pre-ground stuff from the grocery store. In any case, what you should have here on the stovetop is all in one pot, all the ingredients except for the oats. Let this simmer for at least an hour, or however long it takes for the onions and the meat to get super tender. You're going to be tasting here during this time for both flavor and texture. Keep in mind, some of the meat, especially the ground heart meat, may be a little tough, so give it time to get where it needs to be. So you have your meat and liquid mixture simmering on low for a while. You've got to the point where there's a good deal of pork fat rendered and floating on the top, and you've been seasoning with salt, white and black pepper, and MSG, and you've been tasting for flavor and texture, and everything seems to be about right. Now comes the time to add in the steel cutouts. In the recipe here, my ratio is a little bit drier than what's on the back of the container of oats. They've got here a 1:4 or a 2:8 ratio of oats to water, where I've got a 3:8 ratio of oats to liquid. This is because, one, the oats will also be absorbing liquid from the meat in the form of juices and fat, as well as juices from the onion. And two, because I want to err on the dry side in general, because if the oats get to cooking and absorbing liquid and the mix is looking too dry, it's easy to just add more water. But on the other hand, if the mix is still looking too liquidy and the oats are almost done cooking, then it's too late to do anything about that. Once I added the oats, they started absorbing the liquid and fat, and I did end up having to add a little more water, and so the whole thing came up almost to the top of the pot. Now, with this method of erring on the dry side with the oats and adding in more liquid as needed, you will need to be constantly stirring and checking the consistency to make sure it doesn't get too stiff and dry. Otherwise, you could risk having a burnt at the bottom of the pot situation. And on that, you also need a good thick pot with a thick bottom to it to make sure you don't get any burn to the bottom, which can contaminate the taste of the whole batch. So once I've got the oats cooked to the doneness I want them, and I've got the mix thick enough, and you can see here the spoon is standing straight up in the pan. That's how thick it needs to be. So once I've got that, I pour the Goetta mix into flatter containers to cool down so it can be molded into shapes for storage the next day. So I let the Goetta cool and firm up completely overnight. Then the next day it can be portioned out and wrapped in cling film. I'll usually go with a roll shape, that way it's easier to cut into patties. I cut it with the plastic on and then take the rings of plastic off of each disc before finishing it in a nonstick pan. So that's it for this one. I hope you've been able to take away a couple of key lessons here that you can use to up your Goetta game. And of course, hit that like and subscribe button to keep up with the latest culinary deep dives and words of wisdom from Elite Recipe Source, the #1 source on YouTube for kitchen excellence and home to the best recipes out there online anywhere.